So, good afternoon, everybody. I believe it is time for us to begin. It's a very quick change over from the previous panel. This is the panel on religion and populism. My name is Milan Babík. I'm director of Václav Havel Library. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here and an honor to be here. And I want to introduce our two panelists, beginning with Grace Davie, Professor Emerita, University of Exeter, and Jiří Pehe, Director of NYU Prague, who will be joining me in conversation today. So, populism obviously is a major force in contemporary politics, as is religion. We see the collusion of religion and populism in many countries in the Western world, and not only the Western world. The US election is coming up. We know about the Christian evangelicals and their role in American politics, but we could be looking at Poland, we could be looking at the Russian Orthodox Church, for that matter, closer to home. So, to what extent is the growth of religious fundamentalism and its alliance with political populism fueled by fears of secularization, for example? That's one of the questions that we want to ponder today. But even before that, I want to begin with a still more fundamental question. Can democracy exist without religion?
Shall I go first?
Why not?
Thank you for my invitation here. I'm really delighted and flattered to be here. It's a pleasure. I don't know if you know the scholar Hartmut Rosa, a German social theorist, and he has written a book called Democracy Needs Religion. He argues that democracy would be much healthier if it paid more attention to religion and allowed religion to play a creative part in the democratic process. I find his work very interesting, but I would in fact turn the question around the other way and say that a regime that does not give adequate space for seriously held religion is not a democracy. Mm-hmm. I would call that a defining feature of a democracy, that it allows space for those who wish and keep the law, of course, do so within the law, to believe what they wish in terms of their religious convictions and practice. If that cannot happen, the regime is not a democracy. There are, of course, forms of religion that do not keep those conditions, and we perhaps will think about those in due course. But that's where I would start, that in a flourishing democracy, you must have that space and be generous about it, and hope that the religion in question, or the religions in question, will reciprocate that generosity and play their role according to the democratic process.
Mm-hmm. Jiří Pehe.
Well, I think that, of course, any healthy democracy, liberal democracy, has to give space to religion. Otherwise, it would not be a democratic system. The question that we are talking about is whether democracy needs religion, which is a different question. And I would say that it depends on the kind of religion, depends on how the religion is, how that space for religion is defined in that liberal democracy. And we can see, if you look at it in comparative terms, we can see that we have countries which have certainly, they have something that we could call a religion, but it's not certainly one of the big religions of the world, and those countries are religious in a very sort of lukewarm way, like some of the East Asian countries, and they have healthy democracies. Mm-hmm. We have countries that are secularized to a large extent, like this country, where a very small percentage of people are actually organized in any church, and it's a functioning democracy. And then we have countries which are, at least formally, very religious, like the United States, and we can see that that country now has a lot of problems with populism and so on. So I would say that the answer to this question is not yes or no. It's a very complicated thing that depends on many variables.
Mm-hmm. So my understanding is that basically a well-functioning Western liberal democracy does need to protect space for religious expression. I think we all would agree to that. But should it go beyond that, and maybe even before we get to that point, whether there should be a more active engagement with the need for religious expression and so on, perhaps going off of your remarks, isn't religion much too sweeping for the purposes of political and sociological analysis? And I'm thinking now, for example, about the United States, where sociologists, scholars of religion such as Robert Bellah have come up with the notion of civil religion. In other words, a set of rituals, norms, behavior that essentially uses the country as its object of worship and turns it into a kind of a religious idol, if we wish to use that term. So should we perhaps not discuss the phenomenon using finer categories: civil religion, secularized religion, traditional religion, and so on?
I'm going to pull your question a little bit to make this point, if I may. It is relevant, I promise you. Probably about 8 or 10 years ago now, I was involved in a very interesting piece of work, which was part of something called the International Panel for Social Progress. And I was asked with a colleague, an American colleague, to head up the section on is religion positive or negative in terms of social progress. So democracy, of course, was part of this. And the first thing that happened is we presented ourselves. There were about 8 or 10 of us concerned with this chapter in a group of 200 or 300 people, mostly very senior social scientists. And if you said to them, I'm working with the group on religion, they would look at you as if, why are you here if this is a panel on social progress? Because their assumption was twofold. Either religion was irrelevant, or it was toxic. The thought that it could be beneficial to social progress, democracy being an example of social progress, or an example of a good regime or positive regime in terms of wider living, was not part of their thinking. And that was powerful and it was strong. And so we dug our heels in and thought, well, how do we come to terms with this situation? And we started by defining religion. This is what I want to contribute, really, because I found it very useful in my work subsequently. I'm not going to talk about belief systems, because there are any number of belief systems which come under the banner religion. But if you think of religion as the power of religious ideas to motivate, and of religious practices to shape ways of life, and of religious communities to mobilize and extend the reach of social change, and of religious leaders and symbols to legitimate calls to action, you see that you have something very powerful, or potentially very powerful. Now, hitch that to the right wagon, and you can make a very positive difference. Allow it to entangle itself with a negative regime, like Iran, and you are in big trouble. So pay attention to religion and its very different aspects, and look out for where it's heading. It has the potential to do a considerable amount of good, and I can give you some examples in due course if you wish, but it can also do a lot of harm. And if you think of the regime in Iran, I think it's a very good example. If you think of the regime in Russia currently, and if you look back over Russian history, I'm not sure whether I'm surprised or not to see the role of the Orthodox Church right now. You can see it's very, very damaging. In the Polish case, I think it's very interesting because you can see that the really strong church that withstood communism, stood up to it, also ran the risk of being a threat to democracy in different times. And so you need to keep on rethinking this question. You have a powerful force, a very varied force, but you need to push it or try to ensure that it's going in the right direction. Because the wrong combinations of political and religion can be extremely dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And that is populism, or at least in part.
Would you like to add anything to that, Jiří, Pehe, or qualify?
Well, I would go back to your question, or part of your question, and it was whether religion could be or should be maybe a set of beliefs in some higher entity and so on, whether it should be replaced in democracies by something that we call civic religion, or something that makes people believe in democracy and so on. I am doubtful about it, because I think that democracy is a rational exercise. It is a highly rational exercise, of course, based on certain values, which in some countries certainly, or some civilizational areas, were inherited from religion, from the dominant religion, Christianity mostly. But at the same time, I think that this idea of civic religion or civil religion is there is a slight tinge in it of not being entirely rational, based on belief. And you know that children in the United States, when they go to a classroom, have to recite the oath, basically, of. And I think that what is much more helpful for a good, smooth functioning of any democracy is a rational discourse. So rather than belief or something that we call secular religion, I would be much more in favor of good civic education that actually emphasizes a rational discourse about why we want to have this system, why this system is important, good, what are the basic foundations of this system, and so on. I think it's much more helpful than people believing simply that's a good system, because beliefs are good on one hand, but also, in my opinion, sort of go against the rational discourse that is part of any functioning democracy.
That answer certainly goes very much in the spirit of sort of standard Western liberal political philosophy, which tells us that the modern state and the international system were born out of essentially a rational response to religious tensions and wars, and to that extent our present system, territorially based modern state and the international system are secular constructs, rational constructs. But I guess what we're trying to get at here is whether that's enough.
I think you're right. I mean, I'm very happy with, I'm very admiring of Robert Beller's work, and I think it gives you a way of understanding the United States, which is insightful. But I don't particularly like the notion of civil religion. I mean, I think it's a civil culture or ethos or something like that. I don't think it's a religion. Though, across the board, you can have many quasi-religions, and that's a term that people use a lot, and it's fine. But I think your analysis is correct. It's probably better not to confuse the two.
Right.
But that secular state can take many forms, of course. I mean, the French is a very secular state. Where I come from, we still have an established church. And the thing that is often food for thought is I've spent a lot of time in France. I enjoy being in France. It is definitely a more democratic state than my own. It has no we still don't have an elected second chamber, and they do. They have no monarch. They have a separation of church and state. But I know equally that Britain is much more tolerant than France. And so I think you need to be careful what the kind of, at least I say Britain, until recently, was much more tolerant than France. We're losing our capacity for tolerance very fast, which is a sadness to me. But I think you need, there are some forms of secular which are much more generous than others.
To be honest, I was thinking back to, for instance, President Woodrow Wilson in the United States, who is even in this country revered as one of the forces that helped to found the First Republic. And he was a devout Presbyterian, and he very much conceived of his international mission in terms of, in religious terms, saw himself as a kind of a latter-day savior. So that was my concern, whether there is this emotional, religious, in his mind, authentically religious impulse behind all of this. Is there anything about religion that then predisposes it toward authoritarianism? I mean, religion can manifest as an illiberal and anti-democratic force. I mean, Roman Catholicism in Poland has had that tendency recently. The Russian Orthodox Church, the Christian right, and evangelicals, and so on in the United States. But I mean, is this inevitable? In this country, we do remember John Paul II, for example, or Cardinal Tomášek, who were absolutely sort of central to the anti-communist dissent and the forces that eventually in 1989 brought communism and the totalitarian regime to its downfall. So is there anything inevitable about religion being sort of authoritarian?
I can tell you the tendencies in the European case which make me anxious. I hope you will speak about the American case after. There are many ways of analysing what is happening at religion in Europe, but in every European society we have a dominant church. That's the way Europe was made. It's a territorial arrangement, and we have you have your church in Czechoslovakia and Czechia, Czech Republic, I beg your pardon, an English church and a Danish church and a Finnish church and that kind of thing. And that over many centuries has been associated with identity of that place. One of the features of religion in Europe now is that you often find people are still saying they're Christian or still saying they're Lutheran or Catholic, but they do not practice and they are not really very close to the church in any way, but they are retaining the labeling, they are retaining the identity. But they're losing the ethic, they're losing the content of their faith. And set that alongside that as it were, fading of a particular, not a general model. Set that aside, growing diversity in this part of the world because of growing immigration. We are becoming, by the day, by the minute almost, more diverse as more and more people come into Europe for largely economic reasons. Often they are not Christian. Some of them are, but not all of them. Now, there is a form of culturalized religion, the framing of religion, the old framework of religion, which is moving more towards an identity than what I would call a faith. And what is your reaction when you see the stranger or the newcomer? Are you saying to that individual, are you or are you not one of us? Which is an identity question. Or are you obeying the injunction of, here I'm using a Christian example, I'm sure you could find others in other faiths. Are you saying, it is my duty to welcome the stranger? And what I think is moving towards populism is the retention of the identity at the same time as you are losing what I would call the ethic. And I think that is, I see that at home. I see it even in the Nordic countries, which are traditionally very tolerant. You see it in the Swedish Democrats, you see it in the True Finns, you see versions of it in the Netherlands, and you find new kind of comings together of a certain kind of religious thinking which is excluding and exclusive. We are Dutch, you are not, because you are not of our faith or of our identity. And so what I fear is a religion that is culturalized, in some ways secularized, and it is, of course, brought about by secularization. You are losing a narrative. That's what secularization is. And yet you retain your identity. And I think that is the kind of religion in Europe which is unpleasantly disposed and tempted by populism.
Mm-hmm. Jiří Pehe, given your background in the United States, is this situation similar in the United States, or do you see something else happening there? Because certainly the Christian right has in many ways the nature of a tribe, with its hard sort of core, its apostles, its sense of mission, including in politics.
Yes, the United States is in many ways different from Europe simply because the dividing line between religion or religions and the state is sort of blurred. The separation of the state and religion is not so clear in the United States, and a lot of religious groupings, movements are overtly political, or they are engaged in politics or trying to influence politics. It is not, of course, anything that we would not know from Europe in some forms. Like we know that, for example, the Polish Catholic Church was very much involved in politics. We know other European countries where various churches were trying to influence the politics. But in the United States, it is, I would say, it is much more pronounced. And of course, also in the United States, although it was established basically as a country of Protestants, the churches that now are most visible, or at least can be heard most when it comes to politics, are various evangelical churches, which are very aggressive, and they have this evangelical mission which doesn't stop at the gate of the state, so to speak, or secular space. They don't recognize that. So that, of course, plays a very large role in the United States. Plus the fact that the United States or American society is religious in this very in some ways, for Europeans, strange sense that it is almost unheard of that anyone who runs for a political office or wants to achieve anything would say, "I am not religious." God forbid, atheist. That would be the end of that person, probably, in politics. So it's a different culture where religion and politics have sort of permeated each other. And American civil society is also very closely tied to religion, because it basically came into existence around various churches. That's where it started. And so it's still very closely tied to various congregations, churches, and so on. So the situation in the United States is different from that in Europe. But maybe I would say 2 sentences on that, what you asked in the question, and that is whether religion can somehow promote authoritarianism. I think that it depends to a large extent on what religion we are talking about again. There are religions which are strictly hierarchical, and that want, and in their top echelon, so to speak, they sort of somehow blend with state power. And then we have religions which are highly decentralized, and of course Weber and other sociologists noticed that and wrote about it. That's why, in their opinion, capitalism, democracy started in Protestant countries, because it was decentralized and there was not a competing hierarchical system of power. But again, I agree with what we heard before. Religion today is not just strictly a system that is somehow tied to belief in some higher entity. It's a cultural phenomenon, and it's this question of identity. And what we deal with in Europe is pretty much exactly that. It's these competing identities, which very often are identities of people who don't go to mosques or churches, but they are culturally sort of predetermined by their religion.
One certainly thinking about the United States, about, let's say, the words of John Winthrop, 1634, I believe, aboard Arbella, talking about America, Massachusetts Bay Colony, as the city upon a hill, and that being the shared sort of origin of the various narratives of religion in the United States today. And I do feel that just because the Christian right is heavily involved in American politics, that does not necessarily mean that those who stand with the Democrats are not religious. In fact, it's just different varieties of religion, Unitarians, Episcopal Church, and so on. So in the last couple of minutes that we have before we open it up to Q&A and discussion, what should be the attitude of a healthy liberal democracy toward religion, aside from obviously protecting the freedom of religious expression? If you were to give a few sentences, what should be the main features?
Me first, again. I tell you what, it's easier for me to answer this in the negative. It's easier to see what's going wrong than it is going right. If you see, but I will come to it. A healthy democracy should ensure a space for religion, and that religion should observe the law of the land. It should not. It is not always easy, because there are some situations where cultural factors need to be taken into account. Somebody was talking to me yesterday about difficult legal questions when you're dealing with indigenous religions. I don't think that's going to arise too much in Europe. But where I am fearful, where I think a democracy is making a mistake, is when it is making law to restrict only religion and not equivalent secular bodies. In other words, this is very confusing when you're here at a meeting called Forum 2000, because there is another set of emails that I get from something called Forum 18, which is all about freedom of religion. And what you get is a very detailed record of where different religions in different parts of the world, a lot of them in Central Asia or in and around Russia, present Ukraine, Crimea, where law is limiting religion, and specifically religion. For example, registration of buildings and registration of religions, and making it extremely difficult for religions to flourish, simply because the state is singling them out for repressive law, and if you don't keep it, you suffer, you really suffer. That's not a democracy. A democracy has the confidence to give space to religion. And the regimes, of course, that we all fear are either those who have co-opted religion, and it's simply part of the regime. Russia is close, Iran does that. But equally, regimes that suppress religion, and China is the obvious example. And, you know, if you think of Islam, you can't say, well, Islam is by nature a repressive religion. It is not. What's happening in Iran, I think many Muslims would find very difficult, and really say that's not what I consider my religion. And think of what is happening to the Uyghurs in China or the Muslims in Myanmar. So you can't do it faith by faith. It's much more difficult. But I would always be wary of a regime that either embraced or suppressed a religion, and where there is law, a body of law, that makes the life of a religious community difficult simply because it's a religion, not because it's infringing any other law.
Mm-hmm. Would you add anything to that?
Yeah, well, I think that the answer to the question, what the liberal democracy or healthy liberal democracy should, how it should treat religion is clear. I mean, it's obvious that liberal democracies are liberal democracies because they are tolerant, and they tolerate different views and individual rights, civic rights, human rights, and so we don't have to go into that. It's clear that any healthy liberal democracy needs to tolerate and give space to various religious beliefs. I think that the more difficult question comes when there are religions which want to run, for example, parallel legal systems. And or that insist on their people showing religious symbols, so symbols of their religious faith in public space. And we know that various European countries have approached this in various ways. France is one of them. It insists on public space being secular and so on. But of course, we now have this situation where liberal democracies are clashing with religions which, on the one hand, enjoy this freedom of being practiced and being allowed to be practiced, and on the other hand, want to run parallel systems of laws which they put above the secular laws. And then we have a problem which I don't think that a lot of, or a majority of modern democracies have been able to solve yet.
Good point. But it's interesting that I get back to the comparison between Britain and France. Wearing religious, the veil or even the full covering in Britain is not a problem. It is a problem in some kinds of security issues if your face is covered. But it's for security reasons. Whereas, and if I used to teach my students, you know, French children are not allowed to wear the veil in school, my students are bewildered. Well, I sat next to a child, or I sat next to a friend who always wore the veil in school. It's not a problem. So then I have to ask myself, well, what is it about France or what is it about Britain? Rather than, where do you draw the lines, I think is tricky. I think the case of parallel law, like Sharia, is more difficult. I do.
I think it would be very fascinating to follow up that discussion, go into nitty-gritties and specific concrete examples.
Yeah.
But we only have 5 minutes remaining, and I do want to give our audience the opportunity to ask at least a couple. Oh.
You can choose your question.
So do I toss?
Yeah. Well, you can come here.
I'm not going to toss, it will go in the opposite direction, but I'll start with you.
Oh, good shot.
It works. I can speak to
It's a microphone.
It's a microphone. Okay. Thank you for such interesting discussion, and you mentioned several times this countries like Russia and Iran and about this religion over there. Today it becomes more and more evident that at least I'm from Ukraine, from Kyiv. I am representing Catholic Church from Ukraine. And for us in Ukraine, becomes more and more evident that the full-scale war against Ukraine has a clear ideological structure that was born in Moscow Patriarchate. Sorry for that, but I think it's true. They call it Ruski Mir, or maybe you heard about the ideology of Russian world. And this ideology of radical nationalism, I'm sure, denies the right of the Ukrainian people to exist in each fields, historical, language, state, and so on. And even the Moscow Patriarch Kirill, we know him very well, he names this idea as a holy war. It has nothing to do with Christianity, I think. He publicly declared that the war has metaphysical impact and using Christianity as a cover to justify the war crime. And Christians really sorry, as a Catholics, as a Protestants, I think we are really sorry about this Russian Orthodox Church that use and instrumentalized world religion in their interest for political purpose. Because this heretical ideology has already gone beyond the borders of Orthodox community and affects the entire community of Christians. And I think this is a very serious matter, and it looks like a sophisticated, terrible weapon. Even the Bishop of Canterbury, he said that Russian weaponized church. And they use this ideology for killing people. What do you think? Can we still call this Orthodox Russian Church as a church? it's still religion, but what kind of religion? Because when the soldier is dying, they are saying and going immediately to heaven. It's like a jihad in Muslims.
I have every sympathy with your position. I think it's one of the cases where this very powerful force that I outlined earlier has hitched itself to the wrong engine. It's colluding with a regime that is unacceptable, and you can see why Putin has done it. But whether or not you call it a religion, whatever you call it, it is absolutely unacceptable. It's wrong, and it cannot be part of a democracy. It simply isn't, and I am distressed by it, like you are, equally distressed. What I find really difficult, what astonishing really, is that the regime in Russia more or less destroyed the Orthodox Church under communism, and yet it has become something equally difficult, equally terrible now, but in a very different way. And thank you for raising the point. It is nothing to do with democracy, and it's unacceptable. But very, very powerful. There's another question to have, which I think perhaps we should do afterwards, which is how the Ukrainian Church, or the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which is still affiliated to the Russian Orthodox Church, is managed within Ukrainian society. And I think that raises very challenging issues, which are very much about a democracy. I would be delighted to hear what you said about that afterwards, but maybe other people want to ask questions first.
Mm-hmm. Please.
Thank you. I'm totally agree with a colleague from Ukraine, because I'm from Russia. I had a Free Bread Foundation, its first anti-war ethnic initiative from Russia. Unfortunately, Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin use a religion factor, not only about Russian Church, it's about Buddhism and Islam in Russia, because Buryats, they are Buddhists, and unfortunately a lot of leaders of our institution, like Buddhism, they support this war, and leader of Buddhists in Russia, Davie, he said Buryats should participate in this war because we should save our Russian world and our Mongolian world. It's strange remarks, but it's true. And a lot of people in North Caucasus, they support this war because we are against Western values about a lot of genders, LGBT, etc. We want to save our traditional values, so we want to save our religion. And what do you think? How we should work with this narrative among ethnic minorities groups too? Because we try to connect with Dalai Lama, for example. Dalai Lama has a high authority among Buddhists in Russia, but he never made appeal to Russian Buddhists, and they would not participate in this criminal war against Ukraine. Thank you.
Well, I would love to let my panelists speak, but unfortunately we're at the end. I will just say to those remarks that perhaps the trend, the pattern of hitching a specific variety of religion in Russia to power and the state may have potentially very far-reaching and damaging implications for relationships within Russia and the Russian Federation, not to mention that it has potentially genocidal implications for the other nations, ethnicities, and religions. Thank you to our panelists, Grace Davie and Jiří Pehe. Thank you all for spending time with us. It was a pleasure.